Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Ryan Ride Mechanic channel. How the heck are you doing today? On today's video, I have a viewer question. They asked, can you make a video on what the process is post-accident? I said, sounds like a good idea. I'll greenlight the video. So let's get right into it.
Now get ready. Here we go.
Alright, so if this is your first time here, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, do all that stuff downstairs. It does help me out and I do appreciate it. Okay, today's video, we're going to talk about ride accidents. So I'm going to do a couple of things. I want to bring up some topics and some highlights and points and stuff like that. My son suggested, he said, hey, why don't you try using a green screen? So today, I'm going to use a green screen. So let me know what you guys think about this. Okay, little ripply, little wavy, but not bad. I think it should be more of a solid color and definitely lit better, but seems okay, right? Yeah, alright, so green screen, let's give it a shot. Okay, here we go. Alright, so talk about accidents. Realistically, park has accidents all the time, and that is not necessarily from the rides, but they just happen. Injuries happen all over the place. You have a lot of people in one spot. Accidents are bound to happen, but realistically, you want to focus on just a ride accident. So there's really two categories of a ride accident. One's major, one minor. I'm going to get into both of those, but basically in the major category, we're going to divide that into two. In the minor category, we're going to divide it into two. And both categories are the same. It's going to be an employee minor, a guest minor, and then an employee major, and then a guest major. So let's talk about those real quick. Okay, so employee ride minor accidents. What happens? Well, the employees ride the rides as much as the guests do, but the frequency is a little higher for them since they have to do it day in, day out, that sort of stuff. So realistically, the employees are more likely to get injured on a ride, but not in the way you would think, really. We're talking about minor sprains, muscle tissue issues, things like that. Things that you would get from repetitively riding rides like every single day. So that is one thing. If you're I've done it before, like I was working and my neck felt stiff. I'm like, hey, can you test ride this ride? I'm like, no, I shouldn't, because the warning signs out in front of the ride apply to guests and employees alike. They apply to everybody. So it's like my neck wasn't feeling the best. I wasn't about to hop on that ride and possibly injure it further. What's the worst thing about a employee injury on that sort of stuff is that that goes against the out here in the US we have OSHA, who regulates a lot of employee safety stuff, so that's a strike against you from the OSHA handbook. So we definitely don't want OSHA coming in doing investigations and stuff like that. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but it does slow down the process and creates a lot of excess paperwork and things like that for you. The most common things for employees is like heat exhaustion, just a hot day, you're out there working, maybe your ride's in direct sunlight, you can get heat exhaustion as well. Employees tend to get lots of finger issues, lots of, like, my finger got pinched in an assembly, not so much like, for maintenance, we think of big gears and moving wheels and between two big things. But for the majority of park employees, we're talking ride operators, and the ride operators out there can get their finger pinched easily in door units like cab doors and things like that. Seatbelt buckles, lots of pinch points when it comes to seatbelt buckles. Trying to get down in a very tight spot to get that buckle, make sure it's clicked in there, and do a double check. So there's lots of different things like that, especially if you speed up. They're reaching down between two places to try to check that buckle, and then maybe they catch their finger wrong, and then it's like, and you have a hand injury. Very common. For guests, minor injuries, we're going to talk about fainting. It happens a lot. It's one of the number one reasons why rides go down when it's extremely hot outside, because guests in the queue line simply just didn't have enough water to drink. And they mix, it's a bad amusement park cocktail. It is the lack of hydration, so people aren't hydrating properly. There's typically a lack of sleep. There's a lot of times a lack of food. And then you have mix it with extreme sun, standing all day, going around, and then you add motion into that from the rides themselves. And all the time, a guest will just faint. They will just pass out in the queue line. Now, when that happens, the ride shuts down as well because there is now an unsafe condition in the queue line, and the operators are typically instructed not to just keep running the ride because you have to get either park paramedics or actual paramedics there to deal with the person that has just fainted. Although most of the time, heat exhaustion faints, they simply just pass out, and then by the time people start attending to them, they start coming around on their own. But you could recognize the symptoms: hot red skin, dry to the touch. They've stopped sweating a long time ago. Some bad things, but they need medical attention. So we want to get them to a back area, get lots of water flowing to them in a cool, get some breeze going, that sort of stuff. Another thing that happens quite often is the ground and surfaces and stuff around in the park, they become uneven. There's lots of curbs and pathways that intersect each other, and it happens that people can just injure their foot simply walking around the park. They step off something wrong, they misjudge, they didn't know there was a step there. Fright Fest at Six Flags Magic Mountain, I was standing there and we were standing next to one of the areas and we were right on the edge of a curb. Well, with the crowd, so many people around, there was a lot of people that never saw the curb because they're looking up instead of looking down, and they tripped and fell sometimes quite hard on the ground right there because there was a curb there. They didn't see it. And then there is, of course, the forbidden ankle injuries due to you wore high heels into the park. Stop doing that stuff. I've seen it occasionally now. It's not, don't do it. But anyways, footwear can be a big thing because if you don't have the right footwear, I talk about that a lot. 20,000 steps a day in a park without the right footwear is not good for the lower half of your body. Messes everything up. So make sure you wear the right footwear to the park. And then you have other things like a ride can go down to a bloody nose, or a bloody something else. I'll let you connect the dots on that one. So those rides go down. It happens on rides and there's nothing. So the ride says, okay, we dispatch this train of people. The train of people come back. Now a person has a bloody nose all over the place. First question is, what happened? The employees have to figure out what's going on really quick because they need to know if it is like the majority of time, which is simply just, hey, it's like myself. I get bloody noses all the time. Just something about the nose. I don't know what it is, but just be standing there not doing anything. Next thing you know, it feels like you have a runny nose and it's just blood all over the place. So it's like, oh, hey, I get bloody noses. This is just a bloody nose. I get them from time to time. And they reverberate like, okay, like nothing happened on the ride. No, nothing happened on the ride. It's just me. I got a bloody nose. It happens. Okay. So I get up and I leave the ride because I'm trying to tend to my bloody nose. They'll ask typically, hey, do you need first aid? Do you need first aid to come here? No, most guests are like, no, this happens from time to time. It's like, okay. And then the ride gets shut down. They have to cycle the train now. I say, why would the ride get shut down? Because blood is a biosafety hazard. So most employees, whether it be maintenance or typically the operators at the ride, most people are not cleared to clean up a biosafety hazard. Now that's funny because a lot of times what we consider throw up when people barf on a ride is actually not really a biosafety hazard level that it's something you have to protect against. So when people clean up throw up on the ride, they typically hose it off. They take some sanitary spray and spray the area down, wipe it clean with towels, and they have gloves on while they do this, so they're protecting themselves, and then once they're done, they wash up and they clean themselves back off, and then it's like, okay, the ride's clean, they're clean, we're ready to begin operation. But when it comes to blood, you could have, I know this, so you could have a BSL-1 or a BSL-2 in the bloodstream there. So BSL-2s are something you can contract, like if there's blood on there that might have some sort of disease in it. Well, you don't want to touch that. You don't want to expose your employees to touch that. So you need properly trained people that have experience in just dealing with blood biohazards. So these are typically majority parks have these people on site, and they are simply your first aid people. They are not a first aid person that's just masquerading as, like, oh, they walk around with a band-aid saying, hey, do you need this? The first aid people are typically trained EMTs that are sitting there ready to go. They know how to deal with biochemical responses and things like that, to where they can come out there and they say, okay, there's blood, we can clean it off. And they also have special cleaners and things that will actually get in there, clean the blood off, and make sure that any threat inside that has been neutralized. And then they are the ones to turn the ride back over to the operators. And then sometimes after that, even the operators will also do their cleaning procedures on top of that. So they will say, hey, there we go. We got the EMTs are out of there. Now the operator is cleaning up. Sometimes during that secondary clean, the operator finds more, especially on a restraint that has like lots of little passageways and pockets around it. The operator might be cleaning it and going around. They might move the rag and come back and notice that there's more blood on it. Then it's like, uh-oh, they have to pause again, go back and call whoever it is and say, hey, I need the tech guys, the paramedics, to come back out here because there's still more on there. From the maintenance point of view, these calls are typically called out over the radio. Where I worked, we had 2 calls, which was mainly the guest ones were the ones that we really perked up with. But I mean, we had a signal 21, which was an injury. So we would have a 21E as an Edward, or E as an employee. We have 21E and then a 21G. So the 21E was your employee injury. 21G is a guest injury. Now these are things that we wanted to connect with and say, hey, maintenance always wanted to, what's going on? Did something break on the ride? Were they moving something and something just flat broke off and cut their hand and now we need maintenance out there? Or did they do something, like, oh, they were doing their checklist on the clipboard and got their thumb cut by the edge of their clipboard? It's like, oh, okay. 21 Gs that come out. It's like, okay, what's going on with the guests? What's happening out there? And they go, oh, most of the time it's something, it's like, oh, a guest fainted in the queue line, or, oh, they got a bloody nose. And it's like, oh, okay. And then we'd ask the same questions. There's nothing wrong with the ride, nothing wrong with the ride. If we can't get enough clarity in the situation, like what's happening, and we don't get a good answer back from that, it might be, okay, let's go out and ask the question like, hey, what's happening? What's going on? I might actually send the mechanic out there just so the maintenance can clarify, like, what is actually happening at this ride? Is there a problem? Is there not a problem? So these have been the minor guest injuries, minor employee injuries, stuff that we just kind of take care of on a time. The ride might go down for like 5-10 minutes and then come right back up and running. All right, so let's move into the major category now. Probably the reason why most people click on the video, right? All right, the major, what's the definition point between the minor and the major category? Typically, and I can't speak for all parks because every park is different, every management system is different, everyone is across the board different. But typically what the defining moment is when emergency services are activated at some point. So when 911 is called, when the fire department is called, when something like that is, when outside services are activated, that's when it falls into the category, for me anyway, falls into the category of a major accident. Now, this still doesn't mean major. I mean, this is simply just, okay, 911's been activated. It's like, but that statement in alone is like, okay, problem, big problem. And now I've been through this scenario plenty of times. It's like This is not an uncommon thing. I'll give you an example. This can happen to a guest or an employee. They're going along on the ride, off the ride, something like that. The ride calls out that it's down for a guest safety or employee safety. And then we say, and they'll say right afterwards, they'll say that 911's been activated. It's like, ooh. At that point, I'm typically not on the radio because you got to remember the radio broadcasts throughout the park. Everyone can hear it. Everyone always listens to the maintenance channel, like every time. So it's like, oh, I get on the phone real quick and I call up base, and they have a lot of other people calling them at the same time saying, what's going on? What happened? And I'm like, instantly, I'm like, okay, two mechanics. I'm like, go. I'll call you on your cell phones because maintenance, we typically carry cell phones around. I'll call you on your cell phones on the way, but just start heading that way. They grab their tools and they start heading that way. I'm on the phone with our center command. We always call them base. And I said, what's going on with this ride? And they will say that, let's use a multi-case to say either the employee or the guest is having shortness of breath and chest pains. It's like, oh crap, that sounds like a heart attack. Okay. And I double check with them, even though they are really trained, they know what they're doing. But I double check with them. Okay, our emergency services have been called. Yep. Local fire is on its way. It's like, okay, fire has the closest paramedics typically. It's like, all right, they're on their way rolling. And then I'll call my mechanics up on the cell phone and I say, hey, it sounds like whoever is having a heart attack. So make sure when you get out there that you guys keep any pathways open, that you keep the area clear, like get people away from the area so those EMTs, when they come in, they have room to work. Like, don't let that go. It's like, okay. Now, at the same time, the park would voluntarily contact, and again, I used to work in California, which was like, California has a lot of little sticky rules in there, but the park would contact California and say, hey, we had a ride go down and we had to contact 911. They will ask the same questions. What's going on? What's happening? It sounds like a guest or employee is having a heart attack. And then they'll go, okay, as long as it's just that, and there's nothing to do with the ride in any way, shape, or form, once they're cleared out, you guys are clear to operate. It's like, okay, that is simply just we're communicating with our local governing body that there was a problem, major problem, because we had to activate an emergency service. And it's like, okay. And then they're saying like, all right, it doesn't sound like there's a problem with the ride. You're clear to open it back up. Cool. So we go down there, get the guest or employee taken care of, get them off. Most of the time that would be like they ride in the ambulance. They would head out in the ambulance. Okay, we get staffing back fixed around. We get everything fixed, and we do the normal test cycles on the ride, not from the maintenance point of view, but just to make sure there was nothing left out of position. We'll cycle the ride a handful of times and then open the ride back up. Okay. Person's off and running to the hospital. Everything's been cleaned up. All of our infield fences or anything like that's put back together. The ride's safe to operate. Let it go. Another form of injury could be a guest was trying to do something. Let's say they were trying to jump an infield fence. They jumped over the infield fence, jumped down, ended up breaking their leg. It's like, okay, it's the same thing, but now you have a guest in the infield. Now you might have to get your fire truck or emergency paramedics into an area where there's really not supposed to be people in there in the first place. That could get kind of tricky. But in that case, we must follow and make sure that the ride is properly locked out. So we want to make sure that if it's got two trains, that the trains are in places where they can stop safely, that they're unloaded, and then we power the ride down and lock it out, and then go open up infield fences or wherever they need to go get said person with the problem now. And then, yeah, something like that, the park is going to look into pressing charges afterwards, because a person jumped into an infield. They weren't supposed to be there in the first place at all. So the park is like, you violated all of our rules and our policies. You jumped into an infield. Then we had to shut our ride down and call 911. Like, you understand in the media how bad that looks when a ride gets shut down and 911's called. Like, media jumps all over that, and you can't fan the flames enough to say like, oh, it's not a problem. Nope, you'll have news crews there a lot of times before the paramedics get there if they hear about stuff like that. So it's kind of like defamation of character. It's like they don't want to deal with that negative press. So it's, if they don't have to, they won't. And the last one is the biggest one, which is obviously if there is a death or a fatality. And again, this can happen with an employee. This can happen with a guest. This can happen with anybody. So we're going to assume for this scenario that a guest was on the ride and there was a problem and somehow they died. Not sure, but there are cases where people have had strokes on rides. There are cases where people have had heart attacks on rides. Most of the time, these were not due to the ride itself, but there is a set of circumstances around everything, and you have to follow them to the T. Which is, first, it's going to be an emergency 911 call to get whatever it is resolved and get the people off. So they are going to come out, emergency EMT services, they'll come out, they'll extract the person or persons out of there and rush them off to the hospital, because they'll continue to work on them. We don't know the final outcome of that. Then you would have to, for where I was, we would contact our governing body or state and say, hey, this person came back from the ride unresponsive, and we don't know why. And at that point, we pretty much lock the ride out. We make sure everyone's evacuated off the ride, get everybody off the ride, and then we lock the ride out. So there's nothing going to happen when that train or whatever, where the person was, we typically lock it out in the state where it's at that point, because it's not a good thing to say. We treat the scene as a crime scene, honestly. We don't move anything. It's like, if there was a person in the station and they came back and they're like, whoops, they're unresponsive, and there was another train loaded in, let's say the trim brakes right behind that train, we would get rid of we'll take care of the person that's in the station that came back unresponsive, get them out, and then if it's not looking great, which in that case it wouldn't be, but while that is happening, we would probably go back to the train behind them, and probably we would already have the ride locked out anyway, but we'd probably start going over there and just evacuating that train right off the trim brakes. So it's like, okay, those people have been sitting there for 10, 15, 20 minutes now already. They want off the train as well, and now there's EMT and fire there. EMT being emergency medical technician. So they are getting antsy being there too. They don't want to be there as much as anybody else. So they want off the ride. So we get them off the ride. And then we make sure the trains are safe in whatever state they're in. If it's like an older, like an Aero style, Vekoma style, where those brakes that, if you lose air pressure, the brake could open, we would make sure we chain that stuff off, block the trains in some way so they can't move. And then the way we worked it was that if something like that were to happen, we'd set the trains units right where it was. Everyone who was there would have to give a statement. Every single person that was there. If it was the staff, they would have to give statements. The ride mechanics that responded would have to give statements. And this is just an event. It's a recall of events of what happened with times and stuff like that. Guests that were coming off that train and the other train would be held momentarily so they can come up and say, hey, what's your name? What's your phone number? How do we get in contact with you? Did you notice anything? They would get someone would take like a small statement from them as well. At that point, no one fully knowing what's going on, but we just gathering all the information up. So we lock the ride out and it's down. It's down until further notice. We don't plan on opening it the rest of the day. We contacted the governing body. We said there was a problem, someone was unresponsive, and then half an hour later, the park is following up with family members and everybody else, the doctors, the hospital where they went. The park needs to know what's going on too. Kind of tricky because there's a whole privacy of information and all that stuff going on, so they can't say too much. But then an hour later, let's say you get that phone call and they say that the person passed away. So there is nothing to do at that point. The ride's locked out, it's off. We are under an official, it's like an investigation at that point. Nobody goes out to the ride, nobody touches anything, maintenance doesn't start an inspection on it, nothing happens. It is, for lack of better terms, it's a crime scene. Like, you don't want to touch anything. Typically, I've only been involved with one of these where there was a death involved. But typically, that state inspector or a governing body inspector, from my understandings from other places as well, not just California, would come out to officially inspect the ride prior to its opening. So the state or governing body will dig into the hospital records a little bit and say, hey, what's happening? What happened to this person? And then the doctors would have to release some of that information because it's an investigation at that point and say, well, this happened or that happened. Okay. And then they would come back and then have to start inspecting the ride. And the ride gets a full head-to-toe inspection, 100% thoroughly. I mean, the thing would take a full 8 to 10 hours of investigating and inspection. And sometimes they'll ask for multiple people. Sometimes they'll ask for things to be taken apart. It's all depending on that inspector and what they feel is happening around the area. During the initial shutdown, some other things start to happen too. We will contact the ride's manufacturer and say, hey, this is happening. We'll let you know. The manufacturer a lot of times just, okay, let us know what's happening. And then we come back and we find out, okay, this person passed away. We're still trying to figure it out. It's like, okay, they will ask, and I mean, everyone will ask at the time, is there anything apparently wrong with the ride? Is there anything apparently wrong with the ride? It's like, and then there's a fork in the road, yes or no, because no just means that the ride had no problems, it had no issues. We just had this person ride it, and then they're no longer with us anymore. And then the other one is like, I remember, what was it, Bullet Coaster over in China, I think it was, where it was an SNS air launch ride where it rolled back and then ran into the train in the station. I don't recall if anyone died on that one. I don't think they did. I think there was injuries, but I don't think anybody died. Boy, I'm not sure on that one. But that one is one of those things. Hey, is there anything apparently wrong with the ride? It's like, yeah, it rolled back and blew through all of its brakes somehow. It's like, okay, the manufacturer at that point will also start a series of events to unfold, because the manufacturer will very quickly have to find out if they need to release a service bulletin or a safety alert on their ride. Now, there's two different paths for those. A service bulletin is something that you put out that says, hey, check for cracking in this assembly, add extra grease to this, replace this after a couple of 100 hours of operation. A service bulletin is simply just saying, hey, we've found out there's some extra maintenance that needs to happen on your ride. Okay? A safety alert is something that has broken apart and has failed and has caused catastrophic damage already. Something has happened and something is already damaged. And then you would put out a safety alert. And that's the things that when you have one of those safety alerts go out, all that style, whatever it was, will shut down. So if it's the manufacturer has determined, it's like, oh yeah, it was this brake on an inverted ride, then that manufacturer would have to say, well, is it just the inverted rides that are affected, or is it all those brakes? Because just the inverted rides would shut down all the inverted rides. But if it was that brake, then it would shut down every ride that had that brake until whatever the inspection was could be done and verified that you did or did not have that process or piece inside of there. We've had safety alerts, which was, I remember we had one on a, let's see, I believe it was the regatta. The regatta, the tub you sit in has a stainless steel lap bar that comes down. It's shaped like a T, two people sitting side by side, and it comes down. We got a safety alert and to shut it down, so we did. And the safety alert said that at another place, they had, right at the base of the lap bar, there was a crack in the restraint. And what they did was they took that off and they put another tube on the inside of it. I think I'm thinking of the right one here. They put a tube on the inside of it and then put the restraint back together and welded it back in there. Well, the problem with that was, I mean, a lot of fabricators, right? Yeah, that's how you would strengthen that. Like, what's the problem? Well, Zamperla, who was the maker of that particular regatta, and this doesn't go true for all the regattas, they did not sanction that repair. They did not give them the okay to make that repair at all. So just these people came in and they're just like, oh yeah, we did this. And the manufacturer in that case was like, you did what? Not only to say that you did what, but apparently they did it multiple times on other things. And there's, oh yeah, we do this all the time. So that caused the manufacturer to go like, everyone, check your restraints. If there's a tube on the inside of it, stop using that restraint. That is not safe. So, you have safety alerts that go out there that are immediate shutdowns of rides for some problem that can cause some serious damage or a risk to life. And then there's also things that can cause the same exact alert style, but it's simply just inside. So the manufacturer, we contact the manufacturer and they say, okay, well, they have nothing to do on their end. Maybe it's not something that affected them at all. But maybe the particular organization that owns that ride, by that I mean, I'm going to say Six Flags just because they're so big. Right? They now own everything. So it's just like, I'm going to say Six Flags. I was like, if Six Flags had a particular problem with one ride, they might have to check all of their rides in the system and say like, oh yeah, it's one thing that we did on our one ride which caused this issue. And it's like, okay, well, you need to check all your rides for that particular issue. A lot of things like that get brought up when it comes to like operating procedures and how we do things. You could say like the Smiler incident. Like that was something that the manufacturer didn't really have a problem with that accident because the manufacturer, they provided the safety system for the ride. The ride was working properly. It was due to the customer's, theming and procedures that they had in place. There was a hole in the procedures and theming and stuff like that, which allowed the Smiler accident. That was one of those things that Alton Towers had to shut down their roller coaster, obviously the Smiler, and they had to look at their stuff. It wasn't the manufacturer, it was their procedures and their things. So they had to go through all of their rides that affected that entire park. It wasn't so much like that manufacturer's roller coaster or an inverted or a sit down or whatever it might be in that case, but they had to go back through and check all their rides because they had a lapse in procedures. Procedures are dangerous because you typically copy procedures for everywhere in the park to make them uniform. So if one procedure fails, that typically means you have failures sitting in all your procedures out there. So that would be something where you would have to do an internal shutdown of one or multiple rides. So when it comes back to that ride inspection, I'm going to say the governing body comes out and they inspect the ride and they don't find anything wrong with it. They'll have to do all the paperwork to make sure that the ride's been documented as safe. They'll want to see current inspections, NDT records, everything else to ensure that that ride has been properly maintained. And then typically after that, the ride can be released. It's like, okay, go ahead and open the ride back up. Now that's assuming that was a little quirk thing where they couldn't find anything wrong with it. And that the person, we don't know what happened with the person. I was involved with an incident like that. We were running one of our rides, and we didn't know anything about it. This was kind of unusual. We just got a call saying, hey, you need to go shut this ride down. Okay, why are we shutting this ride down? And we got a call as maintenance. It's like, why do we need to shut this ride down? And they said, well, someone died. And we're like, what? When did this happen? Well, what happened was that the person had ridden that ride, and then after the ride, they were complaining about a headache. And then they went on their merry way, and they continued to go, and then they left the park, and then that headache got worse, and they went to the hospital, and then apparently had an aneurysm and died. So no way to end anyone's day, right? Nobody wants that. So no one knew what happened. So as a precaution, they said, well, what was the last thing this person did? When they're talking about, oh, we were visiting this park. It's like, well, what's the last thing they did? It's like, well, they went on that ride. That was the last ride we went on. And then he started complaining of a headache. Okay. So they weren't really sure why he had died at the time. And then they came back and said, well, lock the ride out and let's contact the state and figure out what's happening. So we locked the ride out, and then it took a while, but the state had made us say, okay, we'll come out and we'll do an inspection Monday morning because it was the weekend and governing bodies typically don't inspect on the weekend. But then they had gotten a call later on and said, okay, it was an aneurysm, not caused by the ride, because that's one thing about aneurysms is that they sneak up on pretty much anybody, and there's no real way to determine if the ride caused it. So the state still wanted to see the ride operate because it was like a spinning style ride, so they wanted to verify that the RPM range was still correct. So we held the ride down for the rest of the weekend, and then I believe it was Monday the state came out and inspected the ride, and we did a handful of checks on it, even though everyone was fairly certain it had nothing to do with it. They still looked at it, re-inspected it, checked our inspection logs, checked our training and certification for our employees working on it, and then they were comfortable with opening the ride back up. Now, some of these scenarios that aren't that easy to deal with, these things happen kind of behind the scenes. They're kind of quiet and nobody really knows about it. But if you have one of these deaths that happen where somebody jumps an infield fence and gets hit by a train, you're talking something where now lots of people are affected because you had somebody jump the fence. Now a lot of people are watching that person. Maybe people are recording. You had a train come by and get hit that was full of people. So you have a lot of injuries involved. So what does the park do? What happens to the media coverage on these things? Well, the media typically gets a hold of these things and goes absolutely wild. This is the same media attention that everything gets, right? It's if someone were to get killed by a roller coaster, it is, look, The media says, look, I told you they were unsafe. That seems to be the underlying theme. It's just like anytime there's an airplane crash, too. Look, told you they were unsafe. Car crash. Look, told you they were unsafe. Someone drowned in their bathtub. Look, told you it was unsafe. Media is the earliest form of clickbait, right? Film at 11 will tell you what happened. So the media comes in and they start to stretch the picture the wrong way. And instead of delivering, facts and this is what happened and this is what we know, they just seem to make one big trailer out of it, saying, oh, what can we get out of this? What can we get out of that? Then you have the park's overall response to that particular incident, whatever it was. So the park's initial response might be like, hey, we did nothing wrong. They jumped the fence. They got over there. Like there wasn't anything we can do about it. As a knee-jerk reaction, they say, "Whoa, he jumped a 6-foot fence, but there was nothing we could do. He jumped a 6-foot fence, so we're gonna make it a 12-foot fence and put 10 rows of barbed wire on it and electrify it now." And people that were close to that particular person will say it's not enough, no matter what. They'll say it's not enough. Anytime a life is lost, whatever the response is never enough. I don't care who you are, what you're doing. The response on the other end never is going to fill that hole of that person that was lost. So parks end up doing things. It depends on really what happens. Like there could be rides where someone got killed and the park doesn't know what happened. One of my favorite rides as a kid was at California, Great America. It was Marriott's at the time, and it was Willard's Whizzer, the Whizzer. Great America in Chicago, Six Flags Great America, they still have theirs. Which was really cool. I got to ride that a couple summers ago when I went. But the one in California was shut down and removed. Part of the reason it was shut down and removed because at the time they were loading people in and out of the train in the station, and another train came up behind it and for some reason blew through the brakes. Don't know why, but it ran the brakes and hit the train in front of it. Well, the train that was loading in the station had a young boy, if I remember this properly, in the front row that was loading. Kid was standing up, getting into there. They're bobsled style, so you had multiple people sit down back to front with each other, front to back with each other. That kid was standing up there. That particular station is elevated about 18 feet off the ground. So taller than a normal house, basically. And the train came in behind it, impacted the train in front of it, and this particular kid fell off the front of the ride and died. It was a freak accident. It had never happened before. They couldn't figure out, this is what my understanding was. So I might not have all the facts 100% correct on this, so I do apologize there. But from what I understood, they couldn't figure out why the train had blown through its brakes. They don't know. It was just coming in, and suddenly just went like full speed right into the back of this other train and rammed into it, and a kid fell off the front and died. So the response from the park was actually not just to say, well, we don't know what happened, we're going to open the ride back up. The response from the park was actually, we don't know what happened. I believe that was the official, no one could determine what happened, nor could they duplicate the problem. So it was one of those things that the ride was removed. And I remember I went there for years where the station building was, and you could look up and see the inset of where the tracks sit up there, and they still had the queue line and everything sitting there, but the ride had been removed, and it wasn't like it was removed and the next year something else was put right in its spot. That spot had stayed vacant for many, many, many years until they decided to do something else with that area. But that was one of those things where the park's decision based on the accident was to remove it. I also want to say recently there was that drop ride in Florida where they had modified the restraint. They basically fabricated an XL restraint out of something that wasn't supposed to be an XL restraint. And then a kid fell off of that one. And I believe that one was removed too. So yeah, just verified that the Icon Park, the drop tower there, was removed after the 14-year-old kid fell out to his death. But that is one of those things that there's nothing they can do. The image and that has such negative feeling around it, negative perception of it, there is absolutely nothing they could have done to reopen that ride. And nor it's one of those things, if I was in that exact same spot, I would not want that ride reopened. You know, it's the memory of that person tied with that ride. It's a lot of times that deaths that happen in unusual fashions like that, the ride is removed. They're taken out. That's not across the board. A lot of times manufacturers and ride operators alike, operators being the owner of the ride, they will reopen rides after deaths as long as they can determine what happened. I mean, it's not something that the people of that family want, obviously. They don't want that ride opened back up because that has a painful memory tied to it. But it's one of those things that the operator, if they could say something malfunctioned and they can safely open it back up afterwards, a lot of them will. They won't take the loss. But some of these rides, there's nothing you can do, like I said, to get the loss of that person back. And they will just tear it out and either relocate it to another park if they have that capability or just throw it away. Yeah, that's sad. One of the reasons I don't do too many videos like this is because they have a very heavy feeling to them. Just the whole thing is surrounded in, it's bad. It's one of the reasons I don't like talking about stuff like this, because these things happen, they're so rare in the industry that something like this happens, that deaths happen in the industry. I don't like talking about it a lot just because it's not good. It's not good to bring up, but it is one of those things that's, it is information. It's like, what does happen? Is there a procedure for this? It's like, it's 100% based on what happened to the information at the time. But basically, if it's bad enough, there's an investigation started. If it's minor, there's simple just questions. Hey, minor employee injury, major employer injury, like what happened to this employee? Like, oh, they got their arm stuck in the coach. It's like, what procedure were they violating when they got their arm stuck in a coach? Sky Coaster, the manufacturer of the Sky Coaster, which is called Sky Coaster. Oh, it used to be. I'm not sure what they're called now. Probably still called Sky Coaster. They have in their manual, very specifically in there, it says no stunting in their manual. It sounds kind of a weird way to say it, no stunting, but basically they said it's basically the manufacturer's warning, hey, don't screw around with our stuff. Don't do anything crazy. Don't try to we're going to swing you. These are the big rides where you lay down and swing out over something. That's a Sky Coaster. But they're like, we're not going to try to do anything where it's like, oh, we're going to swing you down here. It's like, hey, when, and the employee's only doing it, it's like, try to go through this hoop at the bottom. I'll hold it up. They're like, that's a stunt. No stunting. They don't want to do that. Don't mess around. The general theme of it. All right, I think that's enough for this video. Like, subscribe, do all that stuff downstairs. Again, it does help me out, and I do appreciate it. If you want to email me, go ahead, ryantheridermechanic@yahoo.com. Otherwise, you can just leave comments, stuff down there. I try to check in on everything and read it as much as I can. Sometimes things slip by, depending on how far down in the comments it is, so just a heads up on that. Okay. Stay off the air gates. Bye.